There we go.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to go and get the presentation loaded up. So Chrome tab. All right. That's showing up?
Yes, Old Testament version, week 4, called History of the Promise, CD, the Hebrew text.
Okay, so this, as we go through here, what we're going to be talking about is the Hebrew text itself. We'll have other presentations on the Greek text and Aramaic and such, but this is just focusing on Hebrew. So Old Testament textual criticism. Textual criticism deals only with the data that comes from actual textual transmission. So we're dealing only with actual copies, actual manuscripts. We're not dealing with what's somebody might imagine they would reconstruct. So remember when we talked in Genesis class about how people were trying to say there was a Yahwist and a Elohist and a Deuteronomist and all of these different fictional characters they invented. Textual criticism is not supposed to deal with those things at all. It's only supposed to deal with the manuscripts and the writing on the manuscripts that we have. It attempts, on the basis of the physical evidence, to try to determine the original wordings of the biblical text. Not that the wordings are so very different, but we'll take a look at a couple of ways that some errors creep in. In this discussion, the word witness is going to be used. Now, witness can be either a specific group of manuscripts or a specific manuscript or a group of manuscripts within a particular language, and they share a consistent text. So we have the Hebrew witness, we have a Greek witness, we have an Aramaic witness, Latin witness, Ge'ez. What does anybody know what Ge'ez is? That's the older Ethiopian language. And Ethiopia has some of the old, Ethiopia actually has the oldest Bible with the Old Testament in it, in the language of Ge'ez. So there are some common differences between each of these witnesses and variants. One of the differences is in the sequence of books. We'll talk about each of these different ones here. Some of them have different chapter divisions. The layout of the text can be different. Their verse divisions can be different. There can be single letters and even single words that are different. And there can be vocalizations and accentuation that are different. And none of these things is actually affecting the text itself. So, for example, sequence of books. This is the Jewish canon. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Remember, you've got the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, the law, the prophets, and the writings. And in the writings, you have the former prophets and the latter prophets, and then you have the 12 prophets. So this is an example of the Hebrew Bible order of the books. In, let's see. In the old Roman Catholic canon, you have a different order, a different organization. This comes from the Old Latin version and also the Vulgate. We have the Pentateuch with Genesis, Exodus, etc., just like we do. And then if you look in the historical books, you look down toward the bottom, you'll see there's Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And if you look down in the wisdom books, there's a section called Wisdom. And in there's something called Wisdom of Solomon and a book called Ecclesiasticus. And then the prophetic books are pretty much the same, except that in Lamentations, you have also something called Baruch, which is also called the Epistle of Jeremiah. And then in Daniel, you have some editions that are the Prayer of Azariah, the Song of the Three Young Men, Susanna, and Bel and the Dragon are all parts of this. So these are the extra ones that we call the Apocrypha. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, if you look down here you see Genesis, and then in parenthesis you have the Greek name that's transliterated into kind of Englishy letters. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticon, Arithmetoi, Deuteronomion, Jesus, Kritai, Ruth, Basileon A, Basileon B, Basileon Gay, Gamma, Basileon Delta. So First and Second Kingdoms in the Greek Old Testament is actually what we would call First and Second Samuel. Third and Fourth Kingdoms in the Greek Old Testament is what we would call First and Second Kings. None of these divisions, the differences here, affect the text critical issues, but they are differences between the books, the collections that we have. And notice in the Greek Old Testament, there are some other books that aren't in the Old Roman Catholic Old Testament, like Third Maccabees, that is there. And let's see, there's an extra psalm in the book of Psalms. Here's the Protestant Old Testament canon, and this is what you and I have handed down to us mainly through the Reformed groups. Typically, historically, confessional Lutherans will accept the deuterocanonical books, the Apocrypha, not as founding for doctrine, but as beneficial. The Reformed in Europe and in the United States won't even accept them as beneficial. Some of them speak very strongly against any of the other books. But nonetheless, this is the typical grouping of books that comes through, like the American Bible Translators, the Kenyan Bible Translators, United Bible Translation Society, and such. I was a member of the United Bible Society for a little bit over a decade. I've got quite a bit of the literature from them. Was a Bible translator. So the second difference that we talked about was chapter divisions. Sometimes a chapter is divided differently, but it has the same words regardless of where it starts or stops in the Old Testament. And so when you're looking up something in the Hebrew Bible, you might have a different verse number and chapter number than you would from the Ekagusi Bible or the English Bible. From one Bible to the next, you'll have different ways of laying out poetry and paragraphs between the various editions. And in the manuscripts, this doesn't really address the issue of textual criticism. This is another difference that doesn't affect the text. I have something. I'm going to try to share this with you on the internet, and if I can, bring it along with. There is a handout that I'd like to get to you that has a listing of all of the differences between verses and chapters between the English, the Hebrew, and the Greek. Now, as far as I've been able to see, as I've been going through E Biblia and Chenu, its verse numberings and chapter numberings are the same as in the King James Version. Is that your experience also?
Yes.
Okay. So this should work. This should work both for English and Ekagusi then. But I'll try to get that to you. It's about 3 pages long. Here's an example from Deuteronomy chapter 23. In the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, the vowel letter that's used for the word dach is an aleph, so it's dacha. But in the Koran edition, this is an Israeli edition of the Bible, the vowel letter is hey. So, but it's still dacha. It's still the same word. So there might be differences between manuscripts and printed editions in this way, where you can see they used a different consonant, but it's not really meant to be a consonant. It's meant to be a vowel letter signifying the ah sound. Then there's differences like this. Now, if you remember, the Hebrew Bible is basically a consonantal text. So in Jeremiah 11, verse 2, you have, let me get my pointer up here. You have this word with a Vav, Dalet, Beit, Resh, Tav, and Name. Now, the root here is dabar, to say or to speak. This ending could be a plural you shall say, so it could be debartem, or it could be a singular you, debarta, with a third person object, third person plural object, debartam. So in some editions, you will have it pointed, debartem. In some places, debartam. It's the same consonants. It doesn't affect the textual base, but it does affect the meaning, as you can see. So this one is, and you shall say, and this one is, and you shall recite them. You know, this means that it's the object, those things. So it'd be debarta, you spoke, tam, them. Up here, debartem, you will say. But all in all, textually critically, it's this same word either way. Another feature about this that does not affect the textual base is the notes that are called the Masoretic notes. This is the Masoretic text is what we're going to be talking about, and we'll look at the Masoretic notes in a little bit. So the Hebrew witness. A witness is a collection of Bible texts in a language. Previously, people called this a version. We're going to deal with what we call the Proto-Masoretic texts and the Masoretic texts. Now you can see here, I've got this fancy M. It's German Fraktur alphabet, M, and it's also abbreviated MT. Proto-Masoretic is either PMT or star MT, like with an asterisk. I should have put that down there, but I didn't. The Masoretic text, what we're dealing with, has these features. It has special points. So, and I'll try to give examples of most of these, but special points in 15 different passages in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew Old Testament. There are special points that are found over particular letters or words. These points register textual or doctrinal reservation on the part of the scribes. The scribes didn't dare alter the text, but they wanted to mark the text to say, hey, there's something that you got to think about at these points. So typically these are little dots that are placed above letters, dot, 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 all the way across in Hebrew. Another one is the inverted nun. That's the letter N in Hebrew. It occurs 9 times in the Old Testament. It occurs before Numbers chapter 10, verse 35, and after Numbers chapter 10, verse 36, and then in some of the Psalms. It's thought to be an abbreviation for the word nakud, which means pointed. It's turned upside down or inverted to distinguish it from the letters in the text. So it's not a part of the text itself. The next feature is called sebarin. In a lot of different instances, and one scholar noted about 350 different instances in different manuscripts, there's a marginal note to an unusual word or usage in the text, and it's introduced by the word sabir, the passive particle of the Aramaic word sabar, to suppose. It proceeds and to give the usual form of the expected expression. So like in Genesis chapter 19, verse 8, the word ha'el for ha'elah, or Genesis 43:9, the meaning all for ad. So it points out a textual variant. Another way of pointing out textual variants is called kathiv and kare. In many instances, the traditional text was felt to be unsatisfactory on either grammar or aesthetic or doctrinal grounds. And some of them were just variants between manuscripts that they marked. So the solution was found in providing an alternative reading to that which was found in the main text. The distinction was made between the kethiv, which is the written form, that's what this word is, and the kare, what was supposed to be read out loud. So the kare would be put over in the margin. The kethiv would stay in the text, but it would be marked somehow by the Masoretic text. And we'll take a look at an example of this in a little bit too. The fifth feature of the Masoretic text is something called tikkunei soferim. These are called the scribal corrections. One place where this takes place is in the book of Job. And you're aware of Job's wife who says, "Curse God and die." In the Hebrew text, this is marked because the original, even though it says "curse God and die" in understanding, the scribes corrected it because they didn't want to write "curse God and die," so they wrote "bless God and die," and then they marked this over in the side to say this is a scribal correction, so that people would know that it's actually supposed to say "curse God and die." This was done for personal piety reasons. After we have itore soferim. These are things that the scribes omitted. The Babylonian Talmud records that the scribes omitted a vav 4 different times with the word echad in Genesis chapter 18, chapter 24, Numbers chapter 31, and Psalm 68, and another time in Psalm 36, verse 7. There are also 7 passages named where certain words are to be read, even though they're not in the texts. So there are 5 passages where words in the text are not to be read. And it's labeled Kethiv velo kari, written but not read, like in 2 Kings 5 and Jeremiah 32:11, which we looked at above. So each of these categories is made by the Masoretes in the Middle Ages. They also arrange their text in certain ways under divisions. These divisions are like paragraphing or readings for a particular Sabbath service. So as you go through, in particular in the Pentateuch, there are some places that will end with the letter Pe, and some that will end with the letter Samech. And they mark the end of a particular reading and the beginning of another one. These are called open and closed paragraphs. That is parashah in the Hebrew. That's what the Petucha is open, Setuma is closed. That's what the Pe and the Samech are referring to there. So a second division of the text was divided into larger sections of 452 Sedarim, which are their sequential readings. This sequential readings lesson was made in Palestine at first. In Babylon, where the Torah was read through each year, the division was made into 54 or 53 parashot, weekly lessons. So the Hebrew Bible indicates the beginning of a Seder with the letter Samech and the beginning of a Parsha by the word parash in Hebrew in the margin. Now, they also have differences in versification, which we've already talked about. Pointing. There are several different systems of pointing for the Masoretic text. There's a Yemenite tradition, there's a Palestinian tradition, there's a Babylonian system. The type of system that we're used to in the Hebrew Bible that we have typically for our research and scholarship is called the Tiberian system. Each of these mark basically the same features, whether it's an a, or u, whether it's long or short, so I, and a, or whatever, as far as the vowels are concerned. The Tiberian system has an elaborate set of cantillation marks as well. That is how to chant the text. And so that's included in the Masoretic text. And then we get to the Masorah. These are the Masoretic notes. The Masoretic notes are usually referred to in the Masoret in the narrow sense, and they're printed on the side of the text in the Hebrew Bible. So among the Western Masoretes, there's a distinction that is drawn between the marginal Masorah, that's the one in the margin, and the Masorah finalis, the Masorah that are at the end of the books of the Bible. We'll look at each of those two in turn. The Masorah is divided into the small Masorah in the side of the margins and the Masorah Magna, or the large Masorah, which is a separate volume of notes. The books are available for purchase. I do not have a copy of the large Masorah, Masorah Magna, or Masorah Hagadol. It's just too expensive for me to get. So in the Masorah Finalis, often what you'll see is a counting of the number of the letters in the book. And we'll take a look at those things here as we look at the text. Our typical manuscripts that we rely on for the Hebrew Bible, most of them are medieval. So we have Codex Leningradensis. It's also called Codex St. Petersburgensis. That is the heart of the Masoretic text. I didn't put up another one. There are several codices of these. A codex is just a book format of a manuscript. One of the main codexes is called the Aleppo Codex because it came from Aleppo, Syria. Another textual source that we have is Qumran. Usually in the text, it's abbreviated Q. And these are the Dead Sea Scrolls that are so famous. Another set of manuscripts for the Masoretic text was found at Wadi Murabat. This is an archaeological find of great significance, along with something that's called the Nash Papyrus. So this constitutes some of our main textual data, our main texts for this particular Hebrew text that we have. So we're going to look at Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. This is the Bible that I read from. I think I sent you a copy of this. I'm not sure. This is my copy. It used to be my professor's copy. When he passed away, his family gave it to me. It's big because my eyes are getting bad, but you can get small versions of this too. I have a couple of small versions. It has a foreword, and in the foreword, it describes how this book came to be. Whenever you get a biblical text, whether it's a Biblia Inchenu, whether it's Swahili, whether it's French, whether it's English, whether it's King James or NIV or whatever translation, always read the preface or the foreword, because the preface and the foreword gives you information about why they chose to do things the way they did, both in how they translate and in how they lay down the text and how they make their notes. The foreword is a very valuable thing, regardless of which text you're using. So for example, in this one, they tell you that they used, as the text base, they used the Leningrad Codex B, version 19A, which is abbreviated as L. So that tells you where this particular group of text comes from. Another thing that these books have is, you look here, I know this is tiny. This is the signs and a collection of the apparatus that's used in the book. And so it's all the abbreviations for the textual notations that are being found there, what those symbols mean and which texts they refer to, the actual physical manuscripts they refer to. Here's a close-up. So you can see this is actually in Latin, and that can be a problem. I'm going to point out another resource at the end of this that does it in English. I don't know of any particular version of this that is in Swahili, and probably not Nekagusi either. But this little squiggle here refers to the Samaritan Pentateuch. So Pentateuchi Textus Hebraeo-Samaritanus Secundum. So this is the second Pentateuch text of the Samaritans. And then here you've got manuscript number 3, Codex Manuscriptus The second Apparatum Criticum Galli. So this is the Galatian or the French. It's held in a French library. This particular manuscript. If you've got the Samaritan mark and it has a T, it means that it's a Targum of the Samaritan text. A Targum is an Aramaic translation. So this is an example of how to read the different abbreviations that are found in this compend of abbreviations. The second page of that, here's an abbreviation that says this is based on Cyril, Saint Cyril. This is editions of the Hebrew text of Kennicott and DeRossi and Ginsburg. Eusebius, down the G here, this German Fraktur G refers to the Septuagint. And then you've got all sorts of Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Ephremi Syria Rescriptus, Codex Graecus in Genere Catanarum Traditus, the General Codex, Ambrosius. So this is the usefulness of these abbreviations is to, when we get into the text itself, the editors can tell you which manuscripts in particular they were looking at when they were making notes about the content of the text. Another set of abbreviations that's found in this book. Up on top here, you'll see abbreviations for Hebrew verb forms: call, nifal, peel, pool, hitpael, hifil, hofel, perfect, imperfect, future, imperfect, infinitive, participle, active, passive, male, female, singular, plural, dual, absolute, construct, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, suffixes. I mean, so those are some basic abbreviations that are used in the text. And then here's the abbreviations that are used when they're talking about the different books of the Bible. And then they also talk about the Masoretic apparatus. So for the Masoretes, when they collected all of their notes in their own books, these are some abbreviations they use to tell you which codex of Masoretes they're looking at. Not many people actually get into the Masoretic notes, although some of them are quite useful and helpful in other ways. Then finally, we get into the abbreviation of the smaller Masoretic notes at the side of the text that we're going to look at. So at the side of the text, we're going to see these little words like ot, otiot, that's the letters, ot, tehilot, for like in Judges. You'll have letters with little dots above them. Those typically represent numbers in the book. This is the abbreviation for the book of Job in Hebrew. So it gives you this helpful description of the abbreviations for the Masoretic notes. And here's the table of contents as it's laid out in Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. So you can see the typical books: Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Devarim, Yehoshua, Shvotim, Shmuel, Melachim, Yeshayahu, Yirmiyah, Yechezkiel, Hosea, Yoel, etc. Here we're looking at Genesis chapter 1, the first page. You have the Hebrew name of the book right here with no pointing. You have the Latin name of the book right here. Along the side, this is the small Masoretic notes. So these are the Masora Parva. Down in the bottom, underneath, these are the Masora Finalis, the underneath notes of the Masoretic notes. Below that, you have the editor's textual critical notes. And then, of course, in the center, you have the text. Now notice, here's that little Samic I mentioned. Here's the letter Pei, or that's actually a Pei. It's too small for me to see. The letter Pei, the letter Pei, the letter Pei. These are textual divisions. Now, this is for reading, to aid in reading. So if I go through here and I say, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim ve'et haaretz, v'haaretz hayta tohu v'vohu, v'hoshech al pnei tehom, v'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim. Vayomer Elohim, Yehi or, Vayehi or, Vayar Elohim et haor hito, Vayavdel Elohim bein haor uvein hachoshech, Vayikra Elohim leor yom, Velochoshech kara laila, Vayhi erev, Vayhi voker yom echad. And then we have this letter Pei. It says this is the end of a parashah, the end of a reading. What we just read was the first day. God created the heavens and the earth. You all know this passage very well. The next one we have Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Voker, Yom Sheni, the end of the second day. And then down here, Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Voker, Yom Shlishi, the end of the third day. So this is one of the ways that the Masoretes marked out their text to make it understandable. A little closer up, if you look, here's this first sentence. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. In this, you're familiar with the dagesh, the shva, the sereh, and harik. You might not be used to the little accent here. This, I think, is a geresh. There are little accents for this one. The atnak is used to mark the middle of the verse, and then you have this little kind of mark here, and then this together. That's called the sof pasuk, both of those together, which means the end of the passage. Above the words, you have these little circles. They're not vowels. They're not cantillation marks. What this does, this one says, hey, look over to the margin, and you go over here, and then, oh, right there. And that's the letter hey, and it's got a dot above it. So it's a number, and it means 5, that the word Bereshit occurs 5 times in the whole of the Old Testament. Now, if you go to the big Masoretic notes, it'll tell you where it occurs those 5 times. Then you got this bara Elohim. That's got a note above it too. And over here, you've got the note, and it says that occurs, God created occurs 3 times in the Old Testament. Here we have et hashemayim, and you've got this kind of complex note, 3 notes in between each of the words. And over on this side, there's a little complex note. There's 1, 2, 3 notes that refer to how this construction is used and how it's referred to in the Masoretic text, the Masoretes notes. So these little things along the side, like this little letter here, lamed, means leet. It means it occurs only once. So we look for this yehi or, that phrase occurs only once. Sometimes these notes refer to other things as well. But in this, see this kaf hey, and it has the number 10, or this vav beit up here and has the number 2. That's referring to the bottom of the page, the Masra finalis. We go down to the bottom of the page, that note number 1, that's right here. And it tells you to look in the big book of the Masoretic notes at note number 1. And so these are all references to another book. Well, not quite all. Sometimes the Masoretic notes say, hey, refer to this passage or that passage. Like this one here says, go to Psalm 66, verse 6. Or this one says, go to Ecclesiastes, chapter 6, verse 3. Now, along with this, and I'm going to go back one page, and I'm going to go to verse 9. I want to look at verse 9 in particular here. Because verse 9 says this, Vayomer Elohim, and God said, Yikavu hamayim mitachat hashamayim el hamakom echad. Let the waters be gathered together under the heavens unto one place. Vatera'eh, and let appear hayabasha, the dry ground. Vayhi chen, and it was so. In this, you notice that we have, as you read through, you get going, and there's a little Latin letter A at the end of El Makom. And if you go further, you can see that there's a little Latin letter B right after Vayhi chen. Okay, so we'll go back to the footnotes here. Here is verse 9 in the footnote. And this is letter A. So this is referring to that note that we just saw in verse 9. And it says, in the Septuagint, in the Greek text, it says synagogain, which if you translate it into Hebrew, it would be mikveh. So compare this to mikveh hamayim. So what they're saying here is that instead of reading el makom echad, the Greek text read el mikveh echad. So instead of unto a place, a single place, it said unto a puddle, a single puddle, or a single bath. The second note, note B, says in the Septuagint, there's some extra stuff. It says, kai senechthe to hidor, to hippocato, to uranos, estas synagogas auton, kai ophthe he xera, which, if you translate it in Hebrew, would be yikaveh hamayim mitachat hashamayim el mikavehem batera e hayabasha. That would be translated, and the water, let the waters gather from under the heavens unto their own puddles, and let the dry ground appear. So what these notes do is they allow you to see the differences between the other versions, the other witnesses, in this case, the Septuagint, the Greek text. And by doing this, they revert it into Hebrew, so it's easier to compare. At the end of the book of Genesis, there are these Masoretic notes right here. And this says, Schom HaPesukim Shel Sefer, which means, and the total of the number of verses of this book are 1,500, 1,500, 34. So it's 1,534 verses in this book. And then they give it printed out in Hebrew numbers. The Chetzi, and the middle of the book, and then it gives a quotation here. It says, V'al charbecha. And then you see there's a little note here, number 25, which refers you to the Masoretic note here. It says, hey, by the way, guys, this middle of the book is in Genesis chapter 27, verse 40. Take a look under there. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, we have, this is the bottom of chapter 1 again. I don't need that. I'm going backward. That's why it's going on. At the end of all of the Pentateuch, you have a similar thing that talks about all of the passages of the Pentateuch and where the middle passage in the Pentateuch is. So, we've got 5,845 to all these different numbers. They counted them very carefully. Oops, sorry about that. So that as they were going through, they tried to make sure that they weren't adding to or subtracting from God's word a single letter. And when we talk about the Masoretic text, it is the consonants, not the vowels. It is the consonants that we're counting and looking at. The vowels and the cantillation points, they're there to help us understand and interpret the text as the Masoretes understood it. But their job was to preserve the consonants of the text. Now, here's another type of Masoretic note. I've got over here on the side this one, and this one. They're formatted a little bit differently. This has the letter kuf underneath. This has the letter kuf underneath. And this has the letter kuf underneath. So if we go into this text and we say, Ad ki yavo shilo. This is from Genesis chapter 49, verse 10. Until Shiloh comes, in the prophecy about Judah, Jacob's prophecy about Judah. This little note here says you should read Shiloh instead of Shelah. The text would imply Shelah, but the Kare, what you're supposed to read out loud says, remember to read this as Shiloh. And so you have these kinds of things scattered throughout the scripture, these preserved spellings, variant spellings of the same word, and sometimes variants between manuscripts of how it was understood differently. So here's Psalm 23. You can see the poetic layout. We mentioned that layout and versification, they don't affect the text per se. This says, Mizmor LeDavid, Psalm of David. Adonai Ro'i, the Lord is my shepherd. Lo echsar, I shall not lack anything. Benot deshe yarbitzeni, in fields of grass he leads me. Al mei menuchot yenahaleni, beside waters of stillness or calmness, he leads me. Nafshi yishovev, my soul he causes to rest. Yancheni v'ma'agle tzedek, on account of, or he leads me in paths of righteousness, lema'an shmo, for his name's sake. Gam ki elech, even if I walk, the gates al mavet, in the valley of the shadow of death, lo ira ra, I shall fear no evil. And then it turns the page. The page turning doesn't affect the text either. So when we talk about textual criticism and these particular notes, not all the editors of the Hebrew Bible abided by this. Sometimes they make a conjecture. When they make conjectures, they're almost always doing it on the basis of what they think is the best evidence. But nearly all of them are just wild because they can't figure out how best to understand the text that is there. Now, I told you I was going to show you a book that is helpful in this, and I'm hoping to try to be able to get copies over there to you sometime of this. I think I sent one, or maybe I've got one in a box here to send you. This is a simplified guide to the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. It gives all of these explanations in English, so that you can go through and benefit from the abbreviations that are used in the Hebrew Bible. Now I'm going to cut out of this and get back to sharing the correct screen here. Stop sharing and
finish yours.
there. Can you hear me now?
Can hear you.
Can you see me now? Nope. Can't see me. Now you can see me.
Can't see you.
Can't see. Now we can see you.
So I'm trying to figure out which are the best versions of these textual critical books to send you. Let me see here. If you were going into graduate school and you were going to be studying Hebrew, the Hebrew Bible, this is definitely the one that I would recommend. This is probably one of the best Hebrew textual critical books available by Emmanuel Tov. But it's extremely detailed, and that's what makes it good and very technical. The next best one I would say is this, and this is I think what I'm going to try to get to you. The author of this particular one, I don't care for his theology very much, but generally he does okay on textual critical stuff. And his explanations are shorter and generally worthwhile. You know, so this is probably the one that I'm going to try to get to you to include for your library. An older one that I had, I've got 8 of these different books. This one is the one that I first learned on when I was starting out in college. And one of the things that they used to do, I'm going to show you a couple of pages here. The last half of this kind of a book has a description of a manuscript and a photograph of the manuscript. And what they do is they go through and they try to explain, you know, how the manuscript relates and stuff like this. And it's a wonderful catalog of those things. But it ends up despite the information, it ends up burdening you so much with too much information. Like, how do I get a hold of this manuscript? How do I find it? How do I know that the person who edited this book of Genesis wasn't smoking pot when he was working on it, and he just included the things he liked? You know, different ways. Different ways that you would have questions about the value of which choices were made. These two, like I said, this one is the best one that's out there right now. This one is the best shorter student introduction. So I think I'm going to try to get this one to include in your library for the textual critical stuff. We're going to go through, in the future, we're going to go through the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament. We'll go through the Latin, the Vulgate and such. We'll go through the Aramaic, which includes the Targums and the Syriac. And then we may go through a couple of others. Each of these is going to be a little bit shorter than what I did today. I didn't cover all of the Hebrew versions. I just covered the Masoretic text. I mentioned the Samaritan Pentateuch, but I didn't cover it. But my purpose in doing this is to actually let you know that in spite of, like we talked about in the New Testament, in spite of there being Greek and Latin and Hebrew and Syriac and the Targums, in spite of the Ge'ez, all of these different texts, the whole thing boils down to a very consistent and readable text that is almost identical across all of these different versions. The differences between them are so small that, boy, I don't know the best. They're just infinitesimally small variants. I mean, there's thousands of them. They're all over the place. But the way that they affect the text is almost negligible. There's almost no effect on the text and the meaning of the text at all throughout all of the different variants. The reason for this is that most of the variants have to do with simple punctuation or how you would spell a word in two different ways. Like when we were talking about, let me see here, library history. Like when we were talking about Matura, okay? It could be spelled M-U-T-U-R-A. Somebody spelled it M-O-T-U-R-A. You know, how is it supposed to be spelled? I think it's supposed to be spelled M-U-T-U-R-A, right?
Yes.
But if somebody spelled it in a different way, you'd understand what it is, right?
Yes.
But that one is derived from one ethnic group known as the Kikuyus.
Yeah.
So they are the people who started this kind of
Business.
Yeah.
I wrote that perfection. So it's not from the Abagusti, it's from that ethnic group.
Yes, it's from that ethnic group. Yep. And you know that when you have things like the word Nebuchadnezzar is the way it's spelled in one spot, it's spelled Nebuchadrezzar in another spot. Well, it's the same guy. It's not a textual variant. It's just a difference in spelling.
Yeah.
Like my name is Joe, or it's Joey, or it's Joseph, and it'll depend on who's talking to you from my past. So, but those are counted as variants in textual criticism. They're noted. So, but I'm keeping you longer. It's time for your supper, I suppose. So, I'm keeping Kenya in prayers. The death of a president, a former president, is not a small thing. And I only saw four different speakers, and only two of those speakers spoke in a language that I could understand. But it seemed that the various presidents, you know, of the area were wishing Kenya well at the funeral, and I keep you guys in my prayers. I'm very glad to see that Kenya and none of Africa so far has the coronavirus. So I'm happy about that. But why don't we close in prayer? Heavenly Father, thank you again for allowing us to gather together across the world through the internet. I ask you to look out over these men and their families and their congregations. Please keep them steadfast in your word, humble before you and your word and before their members and families, and strong in conviction that what you say is true, and that they have their salvation through your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, who led the people of Israel out with a mighty and outstretched arm, gave the 10 commandments and the law to Moses, came into the flesh of Mary, was born, suffered, buried, died, and rose again for us, for our salvation. Amen.
Best our regards to your family, so
Likewise.
Yeah.
we are looking forward to receiving you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that too. Pastor Hein is worried about the coronavirus. We might have to have masks on our face when we're on the airplane.
Is
So,
it a must
well-
that you are going through China?
No, we're not. We're going through Amsterdam, though.
Yeah.
So it'll be Minnesota, Washington, D.C. No, Minnesota and then Amsterdam. No, Washington, D.C. Minnesota, Amsterdam, and then Nairobi.
Okay.
And then from Nairobi, we fly to Kisumu, and then somebody picks us up in Kisumu.
Yeah. Let's see you. Let's you to Nyamira. Thank you.
We'll see you next week.
Good.